if you were looking at this, that God wanted every word in the Bible exactly as it is, he is the one that fed these words to the people to write down, well, then you do have problematic with some things.
Welcome everyone to Deep Drinks Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Mike Licona, who is the Professor of New Testament Studies at Houston Christian University. He's a strong Christian and apologist who's debated the likes of Bart Ehrman on the resurrection many times, including a 7-hour debate. Can you believe we have Mike Licona on Deep Drinks Podcast? I'm very honored. Welcome, Mike Licona.
Hey, thanks, David. Nice to be with you.
So I've always respected you, Mike. I really appreciate the way that you engage with the religious texts. We hold different conclusions, obviously, but I just really have always appreciated you. And you have a new book that's recently come out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the title is Jesus Contradicted. I did not choose the title. I wanted a different one. I wanted, Reading the Gospels Again for the First Time. And what it does is it seeks to address why there are differences in the Gospels. And it comes at it from the viewpoint of saying that ancient biographers were taught in their secondary and tertiary education to vary text through various means of paraphrasing. And we find this. You have classical scholars say that this is what you find in all of ancient literature through the biographers and historians, that they use certain compositional devices that are universal amongst historians and biographers. And so if this is the case, why don't we look at the differences in the Gospels through this lens? Because, ancient biographies and histories have the same sort of differences that you find in the Gospels. And so if we view the differences in the Gospels through the lens of first century biography with these compositional devices in mind, we find that most of the differences can be accounted for this way. And so this is quite interesting. So rather than harmonizing the accounts, attempting to harmonize them, which I think sometimes are just ridiculous attempts, I think it's better just to look at them through the lens of first century biography. And when you do this, a whole lot more comes into focus.
Yeah, I actually went to pick up a copy of your book because it was out like a few days ago, right?
Tuesday, yes.
But it's just not available. I went on to there's a local Christian bookstore called Koorong. I don't know if that's international or if it's just an Australian thing. But they didn't have it, and then they won't have it for another like 3 weeks. And I was bummed out because I wanted to hold it up. It's definitely something that first of all, I like the title, and I like what the book looks like, but I haven't had a chance to read it, unfortunately. But yeah, I'm sure it's amazing. The link for that is in the description, so if anyone wants to check out that book, it's in the description. It's also in the Deep Drinks recommended reading, so you can check that out. So I've got to ask you: do you want me to call you Dr. Mike, or Mike is fine, or
doesn't matter? Mike is fine. I'm pretty informal.
Well, so you mentioned you didn't have a drink necessarily in mind. You've been very busy, and you said that you do like a pina colada.
I do.
Once a year, and you do like orange juice. And you said you might be able to bring some
orange juice. And
did you happen to bring anything? Or did you happen to bring anything?
You know, David, you told me about this, and I don't really. Sometimes I'll keep some wine in the house. I don't drink that much. I'll have a couple margaritas a year, maybe a pina colada, a bottle of eggnog around Christmas, and maybe 2 bottles of wine during the course of the year. So, no, I didn't have anything. I thought about squeezing a few oranges, and to be honest with you, I didn't get around to it. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I have some water.
Well, I've got myself a virgin pina colada because I got to go to work after this, and I'm sick of being drunk in the middle of the day. It happens a lot because of this show. But it's funny actually, because you would expect that the people that come on, you'd expect their drinks would kind of match up, but it's this weird thing that's happened with deep drinks where a lot of the atheists are choosing like water, iced tea, Matt Dillahunty, iced tea, genetically modified skeptic, water, like, and then I'll get like Michael Jones on, and he's like, straight Scotch. We're just drinking Scotch, and I'm like, and all the Bible scholars seemed hard liquor, and I'm like, this is a bizarre world that I was talking to a Satanist, and the Satanist said, I'd like to come on, but I'm sober. I would like to bring you pumpkin scones that he makes himself and tea. And I'm like, in what world is the Christian apologist coming on with Scotch and the Satanist is coming on with pumpkin scones and tea?
Well, so, just remember, Jesus not only drank wine, he made it.
Oh, that's true. That's true. And it's a whole book about it. It's called Hebrews, right?
Oh. Yeah, some of my Christian friends too, they don't think drinking alcohol is okay, and they'll say, well, yeah, Jesus made grape juice at that thing. Well, I mean, you think about that story, the guy in charge of that wedding banquet said, after Jesus created the wine, he said, most people, they give the best wine first, and then they bring the cheap stuff in later after everybody's drunk, but you have brought the best in last. Well, really, if they had some wine and then now all of a sudden you get grape juice, would you think that that's the best? No. So it was wine, the kind that you could actually get drunk off. Now, of course, they say don't get drunk with wine. So that's not saying get drunk. And I've never been drunk in my life. And I don't want to get drunk. But no, I think the wine Jesus created was alcoholic.
Well, that makes, because it, like, to be honest, it bothers me a little bit how fit and healthy you look. Honest to God, like for your age, what, you're 62? Is that you're 62?
I'll be 63 in 2 months or next month.
I showed a photo of you to my roommate, and he said, "Oh, he's in his 40s."
Well,
it bothers me. It bothers me. Like, what are you doing? What are you eating? Do you exercise regularly? Like, you just look healthy.
I do. I exercise between 4 and 6 days a week. I don't do it heavy anymore, or I don't go too hard. I guess I'm just too busy for one. Plus, as I've gotten older, that energy just does not come back as quickly as it used to. So, I'm not exercising like I did when I was in my 40s and 50s. But I try to stay in shape and eat fairly well. So tell your friend I said thank you.
Oh God! All right, I will. So before we jump into the reliability of the New Testament, I wanted to get a bit of a background on who you are, like your story. I don't think I've actually heard it before. And but did you grow up a Christian? Did you have a distinct save moment, the distinct I am a Christian moment, a born again experience? Did you have that, or what is your journey like?
Yes and yes. So, I guess I'm kind of weird in the sense that when I was 7, 8 years old, around then, I can remember walking to church with my mom. My mom had left my dad when I was 5. He was not a good guy. And when we were walking to church, I remember asking her, how do I get to heaven? And she really didn't know. And she said, well, if you do more good than bad, you'll get to heaven. And I said, well, what if I do more bad than good? Because I had a younger sister. I hit her, I pulled her hair, made her cry, things like that. She said, well, then you'd go to hell to be with the devil forever. And I said, well, I thought to myself, well, where am I on that balance? And then my mom remarried, and we moved out of the city to Baltimore County, and we started going to a church. I had a good stepdad, and started going to a church. And one Sunday, they brought in a Christian magician and combined the kids' Sunday school classes together. And he started to relate the gospel to magic, like his magic tricks. Like he would do these tricks, and I don't remember which ones he did or how he did this, but for the first time I heard the message, well, it's not what you do that gets you into heaven. It's what Christ did for you, that he took the penalty of sin upon himself on the cross. And by buying into Jesus' program, by becoming his follower, you can have eternal life. He'll watch out for you. And he gave an invitation. It was a Presbyterian church, and it was, you don't have that in a Presbyterian church, but he gave an invitation. And I remember myself and 2 girls went forward, and I thought, this is exactly what I wanted. And I wondered why everybody else wasn't, but it's like, I didn't care. It's like, this is what I want. Now, of course, my epistemological processes weren't fully developed in that time, and I freely acknowledge that I was literally tricked into the kingdom. but um, but I didn't grow too much spiritually as a teen. I ended up going to a Christian university. I was a music major, and while there, I just heard a lot of sermons, and I got really excited about the Lord. And I was spending probably an hour a day in Bible study and an hour a day in prayer in undergrad. And then I decided I wanted to go for a master's degree and learn how to read the New Testament in Greek. And I was loving it. I was spending hours and hours and hours studying the New Testament in Greek. And then one day I just asked myself, how do I know this stuff is really true? I believe I've got a relationship with God, but I wondered if Muslims in other countries had the same kind of experiences, or Hindus or Buddhists, etc. And I thought, how do I know what I believe is true? And someone introduced me to Gary Habermas, who teaches philosophy and apologetics. And I talked with him, and he shared with me the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And it's like, well, that's cool. Yeah, I got reassured of my faith. But then later on, I began doubting again. And I realized that, hey, I believe because he reassured me and what I wanted, what I believed and wanted to be reassured with. But, if Christianity isn't true, I'm in deep kimchi when I die if another religion is true. And unless Buddhism or Hinduism is true with reincarnation, then I'll get many chances to get this thing right. But, this just became a serious journey for me. So just to kind of wind it up, I ended up doing my doctoral research in the question of, did Jesus rise from the dead? And to be honest, doing a 20-page double-spaced paper with a few footnotes during grad school was a nightmare for me. But this just became a passion. And so my doctoral dissertation ended up being well over 500 pages, single-spaced, and more than 2,000 footnotes. And finally, my doctoral supervisor had to say, Mike, it's time to shut this thing down. I just wanted to cross every T and dot every I and check out all the major alternative explanations, and to give this thing as honest a look as I possibly could. Was I entirely neutral? No. Did I do the best job I could do to be neutral and being objective? Yes. Does everybody believe me on that? No. Do I care? No. I did this investigation for me, and not for anyone else. I did it for me. It's kind of selfish, but that's what I did, because when I die, if God exists, I'm going to be there before an audience of one. And so that's why I live and what I do now, because when I meet that audience of one, I want them to know, I want them to know that I looked at this thing honestly and as objectively and as authentically as I could.
Wow. So were you part of or are you part of a denomination that has like spiritual experiences, or like, do you speak in tongues, that kind of stuff?
I don't speak in tongues. I'm open to it. I've actually asked God to give me the gift of tongues. I don't have it. I do believe that some people do get that. I have a friend who, I know this guy personally. I've known him for years. I know his character. So I know when he tells me this, he's being honest. And he said one time, and he took me to Turkey with him once, and we met with the underground church over there. I went in the year 2000, I believe it was. And he went before that a couple of times. And he told me about one occasion when he was over there with the underground church, and he was praying. The church members all got together. They broke off in groups of 3 to pray. And so he was praying with 2 other Turks. And when it came time, he prayed. He thought he was praying in English. And when he looked up, when the prayer was over, he looked up, and the 2 Turks were looking at him with just astonishment. And he said, "Why are you looking at me this way?" And they said, "You just prayed in perfect Turkish." And he says, "No, I didn't. I know Turkish." And he said, "Well, you just prayed in perfect Turkish." To me, that sounds like the gift of tongues to me. I've experienced seeing people who have used the gift of prophecy and have just said something about individuals that it's like, they could not have possibly known this, and yet it happened. So I do believe the gifts of the Spirit still exist today. Are they abused? Do people are all people who speak in tongues really, do they have the gift of tongues? I don't believe that for a moment, but I do believe that some people have it. And I do believe a lot of this happens in third world countries, and miracles, so that the gospel can go out there and people can see. They don't have opportunities to understand evidence. And I've heard all kinds of stories from credible sources of miracles and stuff in other countries. And it leads to like a whole village coming to know Christ. So, yeah.
Yeah, wow. I was, so a bit of my story, like, you don't know much about me, but a bit of my story is I was brought up as Christian and went to church and things. And when I moved up to be with my dad in Queensland here, I moved up, so I left my mum and moved up with my dad. I kind of drifted away from God for a little bit, but then I got invited to a youth group, and I went there, and at this youth group, there was just like, it was a typical youth group, really bad band, very, passionate preacher. They did praise and worship at the end. I was sitting there, and I remember sitting there going, well, this is like, I believed in God, but I was like, well, this is intense. And then everyone was praying at the front and worshiping, and I was just sitting there being my like depressed self, like as a teenager, and someone came up to me and said, "Do you want to go up the front?" And I said, "No." And I said, "No, I don't want to go up the front." And I remember praying to God and saying, "God, I'll get right with you when I'm like 40. Like I've got life to live. I don't have time for this." And then I almost got up to leave, but there was a girl out the front I could see looking through the glass of the youth hall. There was a kids ministry event happening in the following building, and so they had finished and they'd come over and they're looking through the building at this worship. And I knew her from school because I used to tease her for being a Christian, or at least try and challenge her beliefs. Even though I was a Christian, it was weird. And she left schools partly because of that. She's a great friend of mine now. Her husband was in my wedding party. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. I'm there. I'm in the youth hall, and I'm deciding I can't leave because then she's going to want to like talk. Why are you here? What are you doing here? All this stuff. So what I'll do is I'll just bury my head in my hands, pretend I'm not here. And next thing I know, I felt all these hands on my back, and these people were prophesying over me, telling things that I didn't think were possible to know. And then next thing I know, I was looking down in a puddle of tears, and I felt drunk. For like 2 days afterwards. I felt like a different person. People at school started calling me Captain Christian because there was such a huge shift in my personality. I went from the depressed guy on my headphones all the time to like telling people about Jesus and running little Bible studies at school and being really on fire for God. There's a youth group that came up late, a youth camp that came on about 2 or 3 weeks later, where I literally saw my friends like, some of my friends, like after getting baptized, just caught in like what looks like a vision. Their eyes were just closed and they were just shaking, and just like people were laughing in the spirit. We had to pick up one of my friends and carry him to the hall, and like after hours of just being out there in this next to this pool. So a lot of very spiritual things. And I remember looking at these events and saying to myself, I can never deny this. I can never deny what I'm seeing here, what I'm experiencing here. I can never deny this. But now I don't believe in God. Mm-hmm. So essentially, how does that happen? Well, I don't actually deny the experiences. I think the experiences did happen. I don't know what the experiences were, but I don't hold to the same conclusions of those experiences for myself. So that's a bit of my journey. Like I look at that and go, I don't know what those experiences were. The same way you might look at like a vision of Mary from a Catholic and go, I don't know what happened there. They say it happened. I believe that they had this experience, but I'm not sure. I'm convinced it was actually Mary. Do you hold to that perspective?
Yeah, I do think they had something. And I think maybe not in all of them, but there are some of them that are very difficult to explain in natural terms. So, yeah, I don't know that we could say it's Mary. And in fact, in one case, the Medjugorje teens or youth, I should say, that had it, my friend Ken Samples later on went to Croatia, and interviewed one of the seers. and from the Medjugorje group of youth. And of course, this youth was an adult and at the time, and was still having visions of Mary. And in fact, while he was there, this person had a vision of Mary, went into a trance, had a vision of Mary. And so Ken asked him afterward, he said, has Mary ever spoken to you and told you anything? Yes. What did she tell you? To read this book. Well, what's the book? So he wrote it down. And then he later on looked at it, and it was a book promoting the occult, Satanism. And it's like, whoa, well, yeah, maybe you saw something, but maybe this wasn't Mary. So
I just have to mention, I found this book at a bookstore the other day. It's called The Book of Truths. Have you heard of this?
I have not.
Okay. Teachings of Jesus and other celestial spirits revealing the divine love and new birth of the soul. Okay. So this is who 1917 this was written. This is the partial list of authors. Jesus, Job, John the Apostle, Francis Bacon, Barnabas, Julius Caesar. Who else is on here? There's so many. Barnabas, I think I mentioned that. Bright Star, and what's even James the Apostle, James the Less. It's just got a list of like all these people, and this guy wrote all these down, right? These prophecies. But what's the best thing about this book is Jesus gives a recommendation, a review. He says, this is a quote from Jesus at the back saying this: I implore men to meditate on these great truths, and in meditating, believe, and when believing, pray to the Father for the inflowing into their souls of this divine love. And in doing so, they will experience belief, faith, and possession and ownership of that which can never be taken from them. No, not in all eternity. So Jesus apparently is one of the authors of this, and then recommends it. This is great marketing. This. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could say, "Oh, the spirit realm told me that Jesus is totally cool with this book." That's great. So I bought it. Like, what is this? It was $20, and I was like, "What is this book?" And I can't wait to do a deep dive into it. But so. It's just there's some fun ideas out there, aren't there? So the reliability of the New Testament. So there's a lot of different perspectives on this, and obviously you have an perspective. My first question is: do you think that there are contradictions or things that can't be reconciled in the New Testament?
Yeah, probably on the surface, at least. So. I look at, for example, Matthew. He has Jesus fleeing to Egypt shortly after being born, and then they end up coming back. It's probably because he's born, and then he comes back after Herod Archelaus has died, one of Herod's sons. And then they settle in Nazareth. But when you read Luke's account, you have Jesus born, and then after the days of purification, which I think was 40 days, then we find Mary and Joseph in the temple dedicating Jesus, and then it says after that they went and settled in Nazareth. So the chronology doesn't exactly work out that way. What happened? I don't know what happened. If I had to bet some money on it, I would say that Luke probably omitted the flight to Egypt. It just, he didn't find it an important thing to write for Theophilus, and he just omitted it. We don't expect all ancient biographers to report everything in a person's life, and that would be it. He just does a clean narrative and just has one thing linked to the next, which is something that Lucian of Samosata and Quintilian said was a good thing to do when you're writing a narrative, have these things linked. So, that would be my guess. That'd be one thing. On another thing, you've got Matthew reports that Judas hanged himself. In Acts, it says that he fell headlong and his guts burst open. I don't try to harmonize that by saying, well, he hung himself and then the rope broke and fell down. I mean, that's possible, but it said he fell headlong. So if you're being hung and the rope breaks, your butt's going to hit first, not your head. Oh, well, he hit his butt and then he fell forward and fell headlong.
He bounced.
Yeah. So
Judas was brutalicious, and he just bounced off his big bum, and that's how it. Like you could come up with anything.
no, I think it's possible that I think it's very possible that in Acts Luke omits the hanging, and he talks about something that happened afterward. That he fell headlong. Maybe when they were burying him, they just pushed him over into this Gehenna, which was the place where garbage was thrown, and he fell in there, tumbled in there, and his guts burst open. We don't know. All we can do is speculate, but that's a possible contradiction. I take the same approach with the Gospels as I did when I was studying Plutarch's Lives. There are a number of details that appear contradictory and difficult to resolve. But I know enough through life experiences that there are some things that don't seem possible, like they can be harmonized. But in the end, you find that people were just telling certain portions of a story and leaving out other things. And had they been a little more descriptive or inclusive of other details, then these things would work together. So I'm not ready to say with a lot of the discrepancies amongst Plutarch's Lives, and he wrote 48 biographies that have survived. He wrote more than 60, but 48 have survived. And of those, 9 of them I found report characters who pretty much lived at the same time. Many of them knew one another, and several of them participated in the same event. So when he tells the same story and he tells them differently, Plutarch knows these details. So why are there discrepancies? Well, there are reasons for these, as I discuss in my new book. But some of them may be difficult to reconcile, but I think had we been there, we might be able to see the difference, how they work together. So I'm not willing to say that they got it wrong in many cases. I don't know of anything in the Gospels that I would say they definitely got it wrong. But there are certainly, I would say, a handful or so of examples in the Gospels that are at least reasonable candidates for errors.
Okay, well, I actually didn't expect you to say that. I thought you would go down the because I swear I've heard you in conversation with Bart Ehrman say that you'll rephrase it a little bit differently. You'll say that there may be differences but not contradictions. Have you changed your mind on that, or am I just remembering differently?
I don't know. I mean, we all kind of change a little in what we think over time as we have more time to research and to allow some of these things to marinate in our minds. I've given more thought to differences in the Gospels than probably most people have.
I would say so.
So, yeah. So I probably have said that at times in the past. And again, I want to be clear where I'm at right now is I'm not necessarily saying that these things are errors or definite contradictions. They are definitely surface contradictions in some sense. But whether they are actual contradictions, had we got a fuller report of things, well, we don't know. We don't know.
What do you think about the idea? This is kind of tangential to what we're talking about, but the idea that like the myth of Jesus seems to kind of develop a bit more over time, when it's the myth, but like the story of Jesus. So, for example, Mark, which I'm sure you agree is our earliest gospel. You don't have the virgin birth. The original Mark, you don't have the disciples' encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and that's still written 30 years. 30 or 40 years after Jesus had died. So you've got like a good chunk of time for these myths to kind of, well, these ideas. So I won't use myths, but these ideas to kind of develop, and then you can clearly see it. And then Matthew, there's a little bit more like stuff going on, and by the time you get to John, it's like it's making like things like, and then they stabbed Jesus and blood gushed out. He was definitely dead. Like they're making, like, there are things in there that are like, that seem to be written in to solidify the stories more, or the myth is kind of, again, not myth, but the story is kind of growing. What do you make of that?
Now, to be honest with you, I don't see the story growing, and I'll tell you why. When it comes to the resurrection narratives, before any of the Gospels are written, you've got Paul, and Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus and his appearance to others in individual and in group settings. Paul is definitely talking about a physical bodily resurrection. I can unpack that if you like at some point. But so what he says about the resurrection is completely in concert with what the Gospels report. Mark doesn't have any of the appearances, but Mark predicts them. In chapter 14, verse 28, you have Jesus saying that he's predicting his resurrection, and he says, "After I rise, I will go ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see me." And so when the angel is talking to the women at the empty tomb, he says, "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of them to Galilee. There they will see him just as he told them." So Mark knows of this appearance, and the Gospel of Mark does end abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8. And so you have scholars saying, well, did Mark intend to end it there, or was that not his intent? And then those who say it was not his intent, which is a significant minority of very good scholars, and they'll say, well, either Mark was unable to complete it for some reason. Maybe he died. Maybe he got sick and somehow was unable to, or the ending was lost. I don't know which one. But I do think that Mark. I am of the opinion that Mark did not intend to end his gospel there, because I think it'd be really weird for him to have done so. Now, those who think that Mark intended to end his gospel there, if you got 10 theologians or scholars who comment on it, you've got 15 different reasons that they give why he may have done. So there is no majority opinion on why Mark would have ended in such an awkward manner there. So, and in terms of the spear and blood and water came out, that John may have included that for theological significance, but you have Quintilian, who wrote in the first century, and he says the executioner was allowed to pierce the crucified. So percussus in the Latin, he was allowed to pierce the crucified. So especially if they were trying to expedite death, and it was the Passover. And so I think the story about Pilate ensuring that they would die the same day is entirely plausible, especially because it was a holiday, the major holiday. And even Josephus, later on in his Jewish War, Book 4, Section 317, he's talking about when the Idumean Jews came into Jerusalem around the years 67 or 68, and they killed a bunch of the Jews, and they would not allow them to be buried. And Josephus said the Jews in Jerusalem were incensed at this, because it had been the custom of the Jews to remove the crucified and give them a proper burial prior to sunset. So you would expedite to death by breaking the legs. If they saw that Jesus was already dead, as the Gospels report, then piercing him in the side would have been something that would make perfect sense. People have said, well, what's blood and water from? And some have said, like from the American Medical Association, it's probably the pericardium, the sac around the heart that would have some fluid in it. But I've talked to an emergency room physician, and he said, you'd only get maybe a tablespoon of fluid out if that happened. He thinks that probably in the beating that Jesus would have taken from the Jewish and Roman soldiers, that he would have probably been punched hard in the chest. It would have caused his lungs to swell. And that's where the water came from. He said that makes more sense to him. So I'm not a physician. I can't comment on that. But I don't think just because it has some theological significance that in that sense you would discount it as a historical detail. Oh, one more thing. When we come to Mark and we read it through the lens of ancient biography, the picture of Jesus we have, of Jesus being God's uniquely divine son, deity, is every bit as strong as we have in John's gospel. And John's Christology is every bit as strong as we find in Paul, who wrote before any of the gospels. So you've got Paul at one end, John at the other as bookends. You've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke in between, Mark being the earliest gospel. And I think his Christology is every bit as high as what you find in Matthew and in John.
Well, Mike, I've got a certificate 4 in Christian ministries, and I don't remember. I don't remember that. Sorry, I don't know where that came from, but I haven't heard that. That Mark, I thought Mark, Bartman, I think he says this all the time. I'm even probably in the debates that in Mark, no one really knows who Jesus, that Jesus is the Son of God, right? Is that, or are you saying that
That's
isn't?
what Bart used to say. More recently, he now says that Mark presents Jesus as God's uniquely divine son. He just doesn't think that Jesus made such claims. I'll give you something real quick here. So Plutarch, in his life of Alexander, it's the most quoted passage in all of Plutarch's lives. And he says, look, I'm not writing a history, I'm writing biography, or lives was the word for it back then. Biography as a word did not come until later on. I'm writing lives, not a history. So don't fault me if I'm not mentioning a bunch of the big bombastic things that my main character did during their lifetime. What I'm doing is I am reporting what he said and did that illuminates his character, who he really was. So, and you find other authors saying this as well. So Plutarch's not the one that came up with this, but he gives us a really good angle in what he's doing with biography. Now, when you read Mark in that sense, think about this. It opens up by saying, as Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. Well, now you think it's Jesus going to prepare the way for God, but instead it's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. So who is that saying? Who is Mark saying that Jesus is? He's saying he's the Lord, he's God. Mark chapter 2, Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives his sins. And the Jewish leadership say, well, that's blasphemy because why? Only God can forgive sins. Yep. Then Jesus calms the storm, calms the wind and the waves, which the Old Testament says only God does. Chapter 4, Jesus is, I think that's where he walks on water, which the Old Testament says that's what God does. Chapter 5, Jesus is casting out demons, and the Jewish leaders say, well, that's Satan casting out Satan. And this is where Jesus saying a house divided itself cannot stand. If it's Satan casting out Satan, a house divided against itself cannot stand. He says, look, if you want to rob a strong man, you got to first bind the strong man, and then you can go into his house and plunder his house of goods. And by that, he's saying he has bound the strong man, who is Satan, and now is plundering Satan's kingdom of souls. Well, what human can bind Satan? Chapter 6, he raises the dead, something the Old Testament says only God does. So all throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says and does those things that God does. So when you read the Gospels through the lens of ancient biography, you find that this is exactly what they're saying. Mark's Christology is no less than what you find in John or in Paul's writings. He's just illuminating who Jesus is through his words and his deeds. And this becomes crystal clear when you read the Gospels as ancient biographies.
Well, this is. I'm glad you mentioned this, because this is something that my initial reaction is I disagree with, and so I'm looking forward to. It's been a long time since I read the New Testament. I'm going to go back in and I'm going to read it, and I'm going to try and see for myself, and I'll re-listen to the scriptures you just brought up, and I'll have a look at that.
Well, like I said, when you in this book. This new book, I go through a lot of this stuff.
Oh, is that this book?
Yeah. So it's like, that's why I say, and a lot of my students have told me this after they get through with, when I teach on the Gospels as ancient biography and understanding why there are differences. And they say, Mike, it's like reading the Gospels for the first time again. So it's like they'll never read the Gospels in the same way again. And what they also notice is these compositional and rhetorical devices I mentioned in the book. They start to also see these in their ordinary, everyday conversations, that they've been doing this for years. They've been doing it themselves for years. These aren't unique. It's just we don't tend to think that ancient authors did these things, or the gospel authors, but they did.
Okay. Well, going back to just reversing a little bit to some of your other your points that you brought up. It seems, because Paul's our first writer. right? In the New Testament.
Probably.
I have a theory that I've just thought up on the spot, kind of thought about it a little bit, but Paul had this experience on the road after he was, persecuting Christians, and was he killing them as well? I can't remember, but he was persecuting them.
He was persecuting them, and if Acts is correct, he was consenting to their executions.
Right. Okay. Which is wild. Even back then, I can imagine that would be on someone's conscience. So, he has this experience. Maybe it's like, I'm trying to come up with a naturalistic explanation. He has this experience. It's maybe, a tremendous experience that is, maybe medical in nature or whatever. But whatever happens, he's convinced that he's met this Jesus and he's been wrong this whole time, which causes him to do a huge flip in his ideology. It's very much similar to how I was at church and I became Captain Christian. And then he starts to plant churches. He has disagreements with the people who knew Jesus, but then he starts to plant churches, and he's the one who kind of starts to grow Christianity the most. And as a result of this, the church is growing.
Among
and they're
the
like,
Gentiles,
wait,
yes,
among the Gentiles. And then among that, they're like, well, what is this? We need a story. What's the story about Jesus? We need to know this story. And then, of course, in Greek-speaking, highly educated gospel writers create these what scholars will say theological works to kind of explain that 30, 40, 50 years later. To me, that makes total sense in the realm of a naturalistic explanation, that you have, like if Paul didn't exist, there might not have been the Gospels, because it doesn't make sense to me that 30, 40 years later we have these Gospels written. Like it seems that could be a natural explanation for why things happen the way they did, especially because, and like I want to get your take on this, but the Gospel authorship, we don't know who the Gospel writers were. We know that they weren't, that they're almost, I've had Bible scholars like Kip tell me that he's 100% certain that they couldn't have been written by any of the disciples, and that they had to be written by highly educated Greek writers. Why on earth are people in Greece or Greek writers writing this, and not someone who's writing Aramaic or in Hebrew or a language that, why, even if you're taking the words of Jesus as spoken from his mouth, you're then having to translate them into a new language. Like the first step is like you're missing some stuff there, right? So it just seems, why is that the case? Like, why do you think that? Sorry, what do you think of my theory?
Well, you said that scholars 100% certain. There are a lot of people who go to the wedding altar being 100% certain they're marrying the wrong person, and then later on they're 100% certain they were wrong. So being 100% certain, a lot of people are that kind of certain when it comes to various things, but that doesn't mean you're right. I go with the traditional authorship of all four Gospels, and I'll tell you why.
Really?
I do.
Okay.
Now, John, I'm a little bit uncertain of. There's been, in recent years, people have raised the question about maybe like Richard Bauckham and Ben Witherington and others, but Bauckham says it wasn't John the son of Zebedee. It was John the elder, who was a disciple of Jesus, but a minor disciple of Jesus. I don't find that, I haven't found that argument. I think it's plausible, but I don't, excuse me. It's not enough to convince me. The majority of the early church fathers thought it was John the son of Zebedee. Okay, I think Matthew is a little bit difficult too, and we can discuss that. But in terms of it being Greek by highly educated people, sure. Matthew, Mark, and we don't know much about Mark, but Matthew and John, as a tax collector and a fisherman, would not have been highly educated. You don't have to be highly educated to be a tax collector or a fisherman. But I don't think Matthew put pen to papyrus, or John did either. Maybe Luke did. Again, we don't know much about Mark. He may or may not have. Cicero was one of the most highly educated and brilliant people in the whole Roman Empire. And yet he enlisted the services of a secretary, an amanuensis named Tiro. And on one occasion, Cicero says in one of his letters to Tiro was sick at the time and he'd gone back to his hometown. And Cicero writes him and says, hey, Pompey came over my house and for dinner and asked me to read something to him that I'd been working on. And he says, I refused to do it because without you, Tiro, my tongue is tied. So Tiro did a whole lot more than just take dictation from Cicero. He edited and improved what Cicero wrote. When it comes to Paul was a highly educated Jew. Yet in 3 of his letters, he ends it by saying, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand, meaning he didn't write the rest of it. He had a secretary. Well, maybe the secretary took dictation. Well, maybe, but I think there's reason to believe that they did not do it, especially in one of Paul's letters, the crown jewel of all of his letters, Romans. And in Romans 16:22, it reads, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. So Tertius names himself. He's Paul's secretary, his amanuensis, and he did a whole lot more, we can expect, than just take dictation, because the quality of Paul's letter to the church at Rome is head and shoulders above all of the others of Paul's writings. So he probably used a different secretary there. Now, my point here is this, David. If Cicero and Paul, who are highly educated, can use secretaries to write things like letters, well, wouldn't we expect Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, perhaps even Luke, to use a secretary when composing something larger than a letter, a biography of Jesus? I think that would have been the case. And so what you would have had would have been these gospel authors, at least Matthew and John, that would have told the story to the secretary, who would have written down these notes and then composed the biography of Jesus, presented it to Matthew and John for their approval. Maybe they said, oh, no, you need to include this, or you need to change this to this. And then after the final draft, they had the approval of the traditional authors and then sent them out. And David, that resolves a whole lot, most of the major objections against the traditional authorship of the Gospels, if there were secretaries involved. And it just makes perfect sense to me that they would have used secretaries. We would be surprised if they did not.
Okay.
So if the traditional authorship of the Gospels is correct, then Mark is writing what he remembered Peter, the lead apostle, had said. And John. The majority of scholars don't think John wrote the Gospel of John, but they do think that either a minor disciple who had traveled with Jesus wrote it, or whoever wrote it used one of Jesus' disciples as their primary source. So they're still rooted in eyewitness testimony.
Well, I really wish I could go more into that. I'm only we're like halfway through the interview, and I'm only like 1/10 of the way through my notes. So I'm going to try and
all right, I'll try to give quicker answers.
No. Long answers are great. This is what we do here in Deep Drinks. But I just wanted to. There's a lot of other things I wanted to get to as well. But we have a question from Dr. Cheryl. Have you read Robin Faith Welsh's book?
I have.
The Origins of Early Christian. What do you think of it?
I don't buy it. I think she makes a real interesting case, but she takes a lot of uber skeptical views. Like, for example, she puts Luke in the early 2nd century, which only a very small minority of scholars, maybe 10%, would go that far. And she adopts a number of views like that and says, well, this is what scholars think. Well, it is what some scholars think, but not a lot of scholars, and only those that are out there on the fringe of the theological left. So, she says those things. What?
Sorry, it's funny that you said that, because one of the criticisms, I was looking at the reviews of your book, a lot of 5-star reviews, and there's a couple of lower reviews. And the reviews, have you read them on Amazon? They say that
I have.
Mark's gone too far left.
Yeah, the two negative ones on there come from fans of Lydia McGrew, and they're just repeating her her talking
Oh, okay.
points. She has been a detractor of my work for several years now. So, but if you look at one of them said, oh, Lacona's been going left, and he says that Matthew displaced or relocated the Sermon on the Mount to the top of the mount because as you know, Jesus here is being painted by Matthew as a type of new Moses. Folks, I mean, this is something that New Testament scholars have been saying for years, even evangelical scholars. So this is not a bizarre position. So Matthew is probably the most artistic of all the Gospels. This the guy who wrote that is I mean, bless his heart, he probably means well. I'm sure he means well. I'll just.
Do you think that like maybe, well, like I don't know if this is public, but before we started, you showed me your big Joe Biden tattoo on your back. You have this big Joe Biden 2024 tattoo, and I was like, wow, that's very interesting. No, so I wanted to get your views on skepticism actually, because
and
I'm
you know,
a big fan.
I just the viewers know that is not true.
That's a joke. That's a joke. I have to. Yeah, of course. Or hopefully that's going to get clipped. And like, we knew it.
I am not a Joe Biden fan.
Okay, what are your perspective on Hume? Are you a Hume fan? That's what I want to know.
No, actually, I critique Hume in chapter 2 of my large book on the resurrection of Jesus. I think he gets a lot of things wrong.
Yeah, of course. Well, let me just read one of my favorite quotes, and you can and we can have a little bit of a discussion about this, and I'll kind of lay out my thoughts on this. But it's in Hume on miracles. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless that testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. When anyone tells me that they saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. So just taking that, like not all of Hume's work, I know he has some issues with other things, but just taking that, do you have issues with that methodology?
I do. And I think that's just a poor historical approach. And what's interesting is Hume was a historian, but he was really bad when it came to these kinds of things. So, you know, I look at this and I say, okay, let's suppose we have some really good evidence that a miracle occurred. Okay. So, I think we have that with the resurrection of Jesus, but let's just take another thing. Let's say that you've got a comet, or let's say I gave this example in my debate with Matt Dillahunty. Let's say that some Muslim terrorists came in and they said, Lacona, this is while we're debating. Lacona, you've argued that Islam is false, and so you must die, and they behead me right up there on stage, and everybody just flees the auditorium, leaving my headless corpse on the stage. And everybody flees, and the police are called, and an hour later, the police are talking to people just outside the church, or whatever, the auditorium in which I was in. And then I come walking out of the auditorium. My head's attached. You see scars on my neck, and I'm alive. And I come up and I say, hey, Matt, you know, when I was in heaven, I talked to one of your friends who died a year ago. And that friend shared with me a personal conversation they had with you the day before they died. And they didn't share it with anyone else, they said. You're the only one they ever shared it with. And now I'm repeating to you what that person told you. Well, I think that would present some pretty good evidence. If I'm saying I'm coming back, God sent me back to give a verification once again that Christianity is true, that Jesus is the Son of God. Follow him. So I think we'd have some really good evidence at that point. So you say, well, would you believe it at that point? And Matt said, I don't know, maybe not. I say, okay, well, why not? You know, well, you know, maybe it was magic that you performed of some kind. Okay, well, what if we could rule out magic? And I asked the same thing of Bart Ehrman too. And he says, no, I don't think that we could say it's a miracle. I said, well, what would you call it then? He said, well, a strange event. Okay, well, the resurrection of Jesus was a strange event. You don't have to call it a miracle, but it would still be I think what most people would call it, a miracle. If you have some really good evidence of something, well, Mike, you don't have that kind of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. That's right. I agree. But we've got some pretty good evidence. We've got enough that virtually every scholar who studies the subject, no matter how skeptical, except for the Jesus mythers, but there's not many of those in the world. But even people like Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic atheist, just like you, David, and Ehrman and other scholars who have studied this will say there's no question about it. The disciples and Paul had experiences that they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus to them, and they believed he'd been raised physically, bodily from the dead. Even Ehrman acknowledges that. You even have an enemy of the church who was biased in the opposite direction who came to this conclusion. So now you've got to look at, and these happen now, not everybody, but by a very large majority will agree that some of these experiences happen with groups, which rules out group hallucinations.
Well, how does it rule out group hallucinations?
Okay,
group
hang with me
hysteria
just a minute so I can hang with me. So, and I'll get to that. So, how now the historian? What is the historian supposed to do? The historian is supposed to come up with various hypotheses to explain those facts, and the hypothesis that can best explain them is what is regarded as what probably occurred. So you look at things. The number one alternative hypothesis is hallucinations. So when you start to understand what a hallucination is, it is a false sensory perception. You are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting something that is not actually there, or you get the sense of motion, like they're like dreams. So if you fall off, you dream that you're falling, that is a kinesthetic hallucination. When you dream that you're falling and then you wake up, that's a kinesthetic hallucination. Or you have the sense of touch. It's when you first got your first cell phone and you put it on vibrate and you were sitting in a class room and you felt that you were getting a text message and you picked up your phone and you looked at it and said, nobody loves me. It was a false alarm. That was a tactile hallucination. Well, here's the thing. The people that are most likely to experience a hallucination are people grieving over the loss of a loved one. And yet only 7% of them experience a visual hallucination of that person. And remember, they're reporting that Jesus appeared to them. So we'd be looking at visual hallucination. So 7%. And yet the reports that we have are unanimous that not 7%, but 100% of Jesus' disciples believe that they saw him. Moreover, then you've got Paul. Paul wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. He was glad Jesus was dead. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. Now, what about the groups? Because hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual, they have no external reality. So in that sense, they're like dreams. And I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream and let's have a free vacation. I couldn't do that. She might go and dream she's in Maui. I might dream I'm in Maui, but we're not having the same dream. If I have a room filled with, let's say, 500 people and say, let's all take a sleeping pill and go to sleep and dream we're in Maui. Not everybody's going to dream they're in Maui. And even those who do dream they're in Maui, we're not going to have the same kind of dream. That's because dreams are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality, just like hallucinations. So
what about group hysteria?
Group hysteria is auditory in nature, not visual. So that's problematic.
Well, so going back to my idea is like we have Paul who never met the physical Jesus,
well,
but had a vision.
We don't know that. That's popular to be said, but we don't know that. Paul was going up to Jerusalem during all the major festivals, the same thing Jesus is going to, and so he had to know why he hated Christianity. So why wouldn't you?
Okay, but I mean, on the road to Damascus, it was if the road to Damascus was a hallucination.
Well, then you have others there, because if you're going to trust,
but we've got
others who are participating in it.
that was powerful enough to get him to create that hallucination, that thing that he experienced was powerful enough that he devoted his whole life to Christianity and created all these churches. You can very clearly see how if someone has this it seems very obvious to me. There's a few things. Okay, let me run down.
If it was only Paul, you'd have a point. If it was only Paul, and we didn't have the book of Acts, because the same book of Acts that talks about his experience as kind of a vision, others were there. They saw the light. They heard the voice. They just didn't understand what the voice was saying.
It's recalled that they said. So let me just lay out my argument. It's like historically, we have a lot of apocalyptic preachers in the first century, right? We have numerous stories of dying and rising gods through history.
No, we don't.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, like woohoo. We got a few dying and rising figures. Okay, we got a few dying and rising figures in the Near Eastern Mediterranean world, but these are
Dionysus. Dionysus.
Yeah, but it's very, very different. These are all very different. In fact,
of course they're different.
Well, the Dionysus is tied to the agricultural cycles, as most of them were in the ancient Near Eastern Mediterranean world.
But
T&D Mettinger wrote a monograph on this, and he said, yeah, we got 3, maybe as many as 5, but he says they're all tied to the agricultural cycles. There's dryness, that's death, and then you have rain, and that's resurrection, and it happened every year. He says, and it happened in the distant past.
Okay, so let me get my thoughts out. So we have numerous stories. Well, okay, we have stories of dying and rising gods that you have issue with. We have billions of people who believe separate deities, even unto death. There's the tragedy of 9/11. You know, those people weren't going like, oh, I wonder if I'm going to go to meet 72 virgins. They really believed what they believed. Right. There are people who set themselves on fire believing what they believe. Like there are people who will follow what you would consider false beliefs to death. They really believe it.
That's right.
And so you have Paul, who has this experience. He starts all of these churches, and it just seems quite. When you read the story seems to make sense, and then all of a sudden you get to Acts 1, and I remember reading this as a kid. He appeared to them for a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. On one occasion, while he was eating with them, he gave them this command: "Do not go to Jerusalem, but wait for the gift of my Father promised, which you have heard and which you heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days he'll be baptized with the Holy Spirit." And then later, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes to you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all of Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And after this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. That one little verse there, you can't tell me that seems so abrupt and so what? That doesn't seem like it was. It seems like it was just interjected into the text. It doesn't seem like something that, even as a Christian, I read this and I was like, that sounds strange. Like that sounds like just all of a sudden this happened. Like, and why would he? Why would it gets to me because it's like if heaven is up there and Jesus is traveling to heaven, and he was traveling at a rate that that he was heading up towards the clouds, it's like unless he sped up faster than the speed of light or disappeared and then reappeared in heaven, he's still traveling to heaven. That's why Jesus hasn't returned yet, because he hasn't even made it there, because we can see 13.8 billion years into the cosmos. So it's like
unless he just disappeared and then reappeared in heaven, being transported.
But why would he then lift up? Why would he then drift off into the clouds? Why wouldn't he just go, bang, I'm going to heaven, guys, and then just be in heaven? Why did he take off in a random direction into space and then either then disappear or then speed up to faster than the speed of light to make it to where we can't see, which is where heaven is? It seems like a very human idea that was just pushed into the book when we didn't understand that the world was spherical. We didn't understand how big space was. We didn't it just seems the clouds hit him. What do you mean? Like that? It just, to me, it reeks of human hands in that one. You don't think so?
I guess I just don't find that troubling, David. It's like the same author, Luke, when he's reporting the resurrection of Jesus, he's got two stories in there. He's got the Emmaus disciples, which it says their eyes were kept from recognizing him, and then they recognized him later with the breaking of the bread, and then boom, he disappeared from their sight. And then they're back, they run to Jerusalem to tell them what had happened. And while they're talking there, boom, Jesus appears before them, even though like the doors are locked. And it's like, okay. So
so why lift up? Why go off into the clouds?
I don't know. And I mean, he could have just disappeared from them, or like did a kazoo on the Flintstones like he did in the Southern stuff, or he could have just lifted up and gone. I don't know, but it's like, all right. I mean, I can kind of see your point, but
it's not big enough.
Honestly, it just doesn't bother me.
Yeah. Okay. So, I was having a conversation with someone on Twitter the other day. I should never do that. I should never converse with anyone on Twitter. It's a bad thing for me to do. But they were telling me, they were interjecting to my idea about, it was actually totally irrelevant, but they were trying to tell me about the truth of Islam. I've read the Quran. Have you read? I'm sure you read through the Quran.
Not the whole thing, but a lot of it, yes.
Yeah. Well, I listened to it, and I kind of, I wasn't focusing really strongly. I was gardening or something. But Quran. So I just replied to this person. Quran 434 is enough for me to come to the conclusion that that the Quran is not divine. But that's all. That's all it takes. And just for anyone who doesn't know,
or say.
It says, if you fear high-handedness from your wives, remind them of the teachings of God, then ignore them when you go to bed. Then hit them. Most translations say beat.
Yeah.
If they obey you, you have no right to act against them. God is the Most High and great. And this person responds back with, you got the wrong translation. The real translation, sends me a video, is tap your wives. That still doesn't solve the issue for me, because I said, I think more highly of your God than you do. You believe that the all-knowing creator of the universe couldn't come up with a better way to fix marital disputes than for the husband to ignore his wife and then tap her. I think more highly of your God than you do. But here's the part that you're not going to like, Mike. I feel the same about Christianity.
Okay.
Slavery, infanticide, taking the virgin girls for yourself. All these given as commandments from God, that's enough for me to determine that this book is not divine.
Yeah.
Or at least it's got man's hands all through it. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I struggle with some of the stuff in the Old Testament, to be honest with you. I see how some people try to, reconcile those things. And some of them it's like, all right, that's possible. And others it's like, so I look at it, I see scripture as having a dual authorship. And so when the psalmist says of its captors, that he will rejoice at the day when the babies of the captors are slammed against the walls, their heads are slammed against the walls and killed. Do I think God was behind that? No. I think the psalmist is talking about their frustration and their rage at being in captivity, and how their captors are talking about, or how their captors are treating them. I look at inspiration a little bit differently than some Christians do. I look at it as dual authorship, that there are certain messages that God wants communicated. There we can just understand with the psalmist that, yeah, we understand why you're that way. We feel rage at some things too. There's some things that we don't understand. The infanticide, things like that. Or like in the Old Testament, like it talks about the genocide of their enemies. I do think that Paul Copan and Matthew Flanagan have some decent ways of addressing that. And the late Michael Heiser even gave it a different spin on it, which I think is really good and plausible as well. So there are some ways of looking at some of those things. But yeah, if you were looking at this, that God wanted every word in the Bible exactly as it is, he is the one that fed these words to the people to write down, well, then you do have problematic with some things.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you showing the same empathy. A lot of people, a lot of Christians don't care about that stuff. They'll point and say that how dare you challenge, like, where do you get your morality from? That's the classic one, is where. And I like what the whole conversation about morality. Like, the morality to me is not solved. That's why you've got people debating morality all the time. But when someone says, like, where do you get your morality from? I really like what Dr. Josh Bowen says, where he says, my morality starts from a position that owning another human being as property is wrong. I'm not willing to go into the conversation to talk, like, to look at the weeds of that, because we all agree to that to some in some way.
Yeah, but does that matter that people really? I mean, people could agree on that, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong just because people agree on it. I mean, then someone could disagree.
Of course.
Was really wrong.
That's getting into the conversation of morality. But something that is happening that I'm sure you know Dr. Josh Bowen. Have you had conversations with him before? He wrote the. He's a Assyriologist and Bible scholar, Hebrew Bible scholar, and he wrote a book. Does God endorse slavery? And he has, like, I think he's got 800 sources, like, incredible amounts. Like, it's the go-to book, and he is like, it's very much like, yes, the Old Testament does endorse slavery, but this is the kind of slavery it was, etc., etc. But one thing that he's finding is people will argue with him online. And when he finally convinces them that, yes, the Bible does actually condone or even endorse slavery, these Christians are saying, well, I guess slavery is okay. And that's like a really scary thing. That's something that worries me. And that's what I think the problem. I think the good thing about Christianity is it's kind of been changed. Like, it's evolved with time a little bit. That's the problem I see with Islam. I don't think Islam, because Islam in the Quran, it says this is words directly from Allah. It cannot be changed.
Right.
You've got verses like Quran 4:34. It's like that just there. And I've had a Muslim on Deep Drinks before that's told me that there'd be less domestic abuse if Quran 4:34 was put into law. And I was like, how does more domestic abuse reduce domestic? Like, I don't know. It's crazy.
Let me say two things, if you would allow me, on the slavery thing. I'm not an Old Testament scholar, and so I'm not going to be an expert on this, but I've heard that a lot of times the slavery that you find talked about in the Old Testament was different than what you would find in, like, slavery that you have today, where a person is actually enslaved. It would be something like they sell themselves into slavery for a few years in order to pay off debts. So yeah, they're slaves for a few years in that kind of thing. Now, I might be wrong on some things, part of that, but I do think that was kind of part of it. Another thing I would say is, if Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is almost certainly true. And so what would we do? At the very worst, those texts about slavery and infanticide in the Old Testament, that those would be religio-political propaganda meant to justify the acts of a brutal Israelite king. It would impact how we view the Old Testament and some of the doctrines about the inspiration of Scripture, but it wouldn't undermine the truth of Christianity if Jesus rose from the dead. So that's how I kind of look at those things.
I appreciate that. We did a stream with I brought on Dr. Dan McClellan, Dr. Jennifer Bird, Dr. Matt, Dr. Kip, and Dr. Josh to talk about biblical slavery, and we went through. Dr. Josh gave a presentation about the different types, but there is what you're talking about, the Hebrew like debt slaves, but there's also chattel slavery. There's also sex slavery.
Okay.
But the way that we define, you see, what people, this is getting into the weeds, but the way that because the Bible doesn't call something rape or sexual slavery or something, people say, well, it's not. But what would in this, he's very explicit saying what we call it today. That's what, if you were to bring it back then, that's what those things are called. So, okay, stealing today is the same as what stealing back then, but
just call
tax fraud. Yeah. So I wanted to. We're running out of time. I wish we could talk for longer. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is the resurrection, because obviously that's your bread and butter, and you just know it. And I haven't really looked into it too much, but what I've heard you say a lot of times that if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true, and I have problems with that.
Why?
Okay, well let's get into it. So, well, first of all, I can think of other reasons. Like, this is me just being very pedantic, but like maybe there was a natural explanation for Jesus rising from the dead that we didn't know. Maybe people were just
why you say that? I mean, keep going on, but what do you think the probability is that Jesus, given what we know from science, that Jesus was raised naturally?
Well, I don't.
In a body that is.
Well, we have no evidence of. We have no way to verify supernatural either. So I could say the same thing about the supernatural.
I disagree with that, because I think we do have evidence for supernatural. But that said, it's what we do know from science that would seem to militate against Jesus being raised naturally and his body being healed and being to the point where they thought he was raised in a resurrection and immortal body just within a few days of his brutal scourging and execution. I mean, that seems the prior probability of that itself would be zero, or be so low as to be practically zero. Now, you may not be convinced totally about the evidence for God, but I think if you're being honest, you'd have to admit that there is some compelling evidence for God's existence. It may not be enough to persuade you, but the evidence for a designer of the universe and life itself.
I'd love to get into that. Like, I've heard you talk about this before. Like the universe looks designed, but we only know this universe, so we have nothing to contrast it to. So therefore, how do we know? Like, there's a lot of things I could say to that, but I just want to, because we're running out of time. I just want to
go ahead.
So we've got we have. So you have this statement: if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true. Mm-hmm. But I could just as easily make other statements, and I'll read out some, and just tell me what you disagree with after I've finished. If someone is reincarnated, Eastern religion must be true. So all we need is like a testimony of something like that. Another one is if the resurrection accounts of Sathya Sai Baba, of which you can still talk to people who have experienced that stuff today. The resurrection of Walter Cohen, the resurrection of Radhakrishna, which I've got testimonies that are there from Sathya Sai Baba in the 1950s. Then Sathya Sai Baba's religion was true. Another one is, and this is my favorite one because I'm doing a video on this at the moment. If Jesus didn't return within a generation, Christianity isn't true. Of course, talking about when Jesus said in Matthew 24. Now, people will go, "Oh, the word generation means race," and I will let you speak, but just let me kind of go on. Paul writes to the church in Corinth, telling the people there for them to stand firm until the end. Paul in Thessalonians says, "We who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, when the angels come, for the Lord will come down from heaven with a loud command and a voice of an archangel." He's telling them, we who are still alive. And then, 2 Peter, above all, you must understand in the last days, scoffers will come scoffing, following their own evil desires. They will say, "Where is this coming he promised? Ever since the ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation." And then he poetically adds the perfect excuse, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So to me, I look at that and go, well, hang on. Jesus said he's coming back. This is evidence that it's not true, which, by the way, it's also funny because Sathya Sai Baba predicted he was going to come back when he died in 1989. He didn't, but he still has millions of followers over in India. Mm-hmm. So I'm seeing some parallels here.
Yeah.
So what do you say to that? I mean, I don't know if you know about Sathya Sai Baba's miracles or you've read them.
I don't. I'm not familiar with those. I'd have to look at those, but I can't comment because I'm not familiar with them. What I would say is, it's indisputable that the early church, including Paul, at least in the earlier days, believed that Jesus was coming back in their lifetime, and then they were trying to figure out why he hadn't returned. And so statements of Jesus to the effect that some of you standing here will not die before you see, me coming back in glory. So, people try to look at that in different ways, and about this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. Well, maybe Jesus didn't actually say this. Well, if he didn't say those, then why did all the Christians seem to believe that he was coming back in their lifetime? It seems to me that is evidence that Jesus actually made those kinds of statements. So how do we account for that? I read a book recently, looking to see if I can see it on my shelf. There it is. When the Son of Man Didn't Come. I believe it was co-edited by Christopher Hayes. He's the main editor on it, and a bunch of different contributors. I just read this recently, and it does present an interesting perspective. I need to think about it more, but it seemed plausible to me when I read it. And here's what they're saying. There were two kinds of prophecies. There's the Mosaic kind of prophecy, where God says in the Pentateuch that if a prophet makes a prophecy and it doesn't come true, then that prophet is a false prophet and needs to be stoned. All right, so there's that kind of prophecy. And then you have the Jeremiah type of prophecy, which is a conditional prophecy. So Jeremiah makes this kind of prophecy, says, hey, you guys are going to Babylon, and you're going to be there for 50 or 70 years. And then you're going to come back and you're going to establish, the Jewish nation again and all this kind of stuff. So I think it was 72 years later. So that's close enough because, you could look at round figures. I don't have a problem with 72. That is when the Assyrians took over. They defeated Babylon. And then the Assyrian king tells Nehemiah, you can go and take some people with you and go, reestablish Jerusalem, build a wall. So Nehemiah goes out there. He takes some Jews with him, but the king does not allow all the Jews. He doesn't set them all free. And that's at 72 years. They're still not free. They go, and it's decades later, and they're still trying to establish stuff. And still, most of the Jews are in captivity. So that hasn't been fulfilled. But God tells them that they are to come back to him. Well, most of the Jews did not go back to worship in Yahweh at that point. So what the authors suggest in here, the contributors suggest that Jeremiah, and some of the things that Jeremiah predicted still haven't come to pass. So it's a conditional type prophecy. So if you do this, I will do this. And it's not stated that way at the beginning, but it ends up being a type of conditional prophecy. So maybe this prophecy of Jesus about those standing here and his coming back would be a conditional type of prophecy. So I don't remember what all the conditions that they suggested there would have been. I just remembered it sounded plausible. It's
one of them was
interesting.
One of them was we didn't
look at it.
Yeah, one of them we didn't preach the gospel in all the world. And then the end will come, obviously. Yeah, I mean, this is what I say in my video, but when I was a Christian, we had this local pastor. She prophesied that there'd be a huge natural disaster coming to Australia if we didn't pray. We prayed, and then there was no natural disaster. But if there was a natural disaster, we didn't pray hard enough. So either way, she was right.
Right.
And I feel like I feel like when prophecies can be, this is my problem, but I feel like if prophecies are conditional like that, it's like, what's the point? Like, it just seems like they become useless. They become absolutely useless, like nonsensical. But that's me. And Mike, we're really getting close to time. Can you go over a couple minutes to answer some super chats, or are you 90? Okay. I just wanted to ask you one last question. I have so much more to ask you, but I have one last question I wanted to ask. Paul asked me to ask you, actually. I don't know if you know Paul Enns from Paulogia.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know him personally, but yeah.
He's a great guy, friend of the show. Great guy.
Big channel, I hear.
Yeah, he's a cool guy. And he recently wrote a blog on the Bardoman blog called The Minimal Witnesses Naturalistic Hypothesis. Have you read it, or have you heard it? Okay, so this is his idea for why to account for the growth of Christianity. And these are, I'll just run through the titles. We obviously don't have time to dive right into it, but I want to just get your first thoughts on it. So this is the hypothesis. So 1, in the early first century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one, Jesus of Nazareth. 2, this Jesus said or did controversial things which led to his crucifixion on the cross, a common practice at the time. 3, the resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers.
I would disagree with 3.
Okay. 4, this Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John.
I
Yeah,
mean,
we'll give that up.
he's going to have a number of followers that we don't know what happened to them. That can be said about any major figure, but no, I think we know about what happened to some more than that.
Okay. 5, distraught after death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him. Of course, you disagree with that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say mistakenly, but certainly everybody would agree that Peter came to believe Jesus had appeared to him.
Yep. 6, Jesus had a brother. James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement, perhaps also one of the disciples named John. Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism with a focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events. Paul or Saul.
We'll go back to number 7.
Yep.
Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism with the focus on rather than accurately transmitting historical events. No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think that they were capable of reporting accurate history. You've got things like Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, who goes over some of the Jesus sayings at the Last Supper with the Eucharist. And then when Luke writes his gospel somewhere between 5 to 35 years later, it's virtually verbatim. So there was this Jesus tradition that was, I think, was passed along in its integrity. And that's why they had oral tradition as well. That's, you read this in the 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 through 7, that they passed on. I delivered to you what I also received. And he died, was buried, was raised, he appeared. And it follows the same kind of stuff that you find in the Gospels. I mean, we could go on and things like that. And then you have the sermon summaries, which is considered to be summaries, charismatic summaries that we have encapsulated in Acts. Most scholars believe that too.
Okay. 8, Paul, Saul, a Pharisee who had been persecuting the new Christians out of sincere belief that they were serving God, experienced a non-veridical vision of the allegedly resurrected Jesus.
Non-veridical? I mean, it depends if you take the story of Acts. If you take the story of Acts seriously, in Acts 9, 22 and 26, it talks about bystanders there that also participated in that experience. So that would be veridical if the story is true. You can't just, I mean, maybe you just selectively look at the vision part, but selectively reject the other things that would, nullify your hypothesis here. But that's a buffet style of criticism where you just pick the food you like and reject the rest just because it doesn't fit your mood at the time.
You guys should have a discussion, I think. It'd be really, really interesting. Paul met Peter and John, but they didn't see eye to eye.
That's true. On some things they didn't. I mean, you find in Galatians chapter 1, which is an undisputed letter of Paul, he goes up, he spends 15 days with Peter and also saw James, the brother of Jesus at that time. But in Acts chapter 2, they go up there and he runs the gospel message past them. This is in verses 1 through 10. Runs the gospel message past the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John, to ensure that he's on message with what they're preaching. And he says they extended the right hand of fellowship and didn't add anything to what he said. So when it comes to the gospel message itself, the essentials of the Christian faith, they were in agreement. It's not until a few verses later that Paul talks about how after that event, Peter came and visited them in Antioch, and there were some of men of James. They seemed to be legalists who were insisting that the Jews continue with the Jewish law at that point. And so Peter refuses to eat in the same room as the Gentile Christians. And this is where Paul rebukes Peter to his face. But later on, we find Peter accepting Gentiles. If Acts 15 is correct, he's now accepting Gentiles into the fold. He understands this because he says God revealed that to him. So, yeah, they had some theological misunderstandings at some point, but it seems like they resolved those things.
Okay. 10. Several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting and circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives.
Yeah, again, as we talked about earlier, I do think that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the traditional authors, I think there's decent evidence that the traditional authors are behind those Gospels. And yes, they probably used Greek-speaking secretaries to write these things down. And Greek was the lingua franca of that day. So you would if you want to reach the world, you want to do it in the language that everybody can understand, or the most people can understand.
Cool.
Paul was a Jew, and he wrote in Greek, right? He wrote in Greek. So, yeah.
Oh, I never thought about that, actually. I haven't gotten to Paul, like in my thinking. I'm still in the Gospels, but that's interesting. I didn't actually consider about that. Okay, you'd think I'd learn this in my Cert 4 of Christian Ministries, which it's huge education there. Okay, 11. Occasionally, some early Christians engage in disruptive behavior and face consequences as a result. That's pretty
politically,
yeah. With that.
Yeah.
And 12, centuries later in 303
and hold
AD,
on a second, that disruptive behavior we're talking about in the early church, that'd be among some of the Jews, where the Jewish leaders, they were the ones protesting the Christians in the synagogues. And finally, the Christians were excommunicated. And the Jewish leaders were causing a lot of problems at that point. So then you got to say, well, who was causing the disruptive behavior? Was it the Christians or was it the Jewish leaders at that time? And I'm not anti-Semitism here. It's not anti-Semitic here, because these people, Paul and the early Christians, were Jews. So you have that. And the Romans started putting them to death because what they were saying is the Romans didn't care if you believed in your own God. What got the Christians in trouble was they're saying Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. And they refused to bow the knee to Caesar. And that's what got them executed and why the Romans called them atheists.
I've always found that interesting, actually. And number 12, centuries later in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome, but it gained legal protection 10 years later and soon became the Roman Empire's first official religion, marking its transformation towards the institution we know today.
Okay.
So, all right, you've obviously you need to look more, read the other text in this, and Paul's got a video on this. Give us a percentage. What is the percentage chance you think that holds water?
0. And I'm
0%.
not. I'm not just trying to say that. I mean, there's a lot of wrong with what he just said. So when you get some of these major pillars wrong, that just kind of that just destroys the overall hypothesis.
What do you think is the main problem? What would bring it from a 0% to a 1%?
I'd have to go back and look at the 12 or 13 points again, but I mean, just some of them were just outright wrong.
Okay, interesting. I'd love to see a conversation between you guys. So thank you so much for coming on. We have a few super chats. I first want to just shout out the Patreon Archbishops. Thank you to Jason Rollins, Matthew Monga, Digital Hammurabi, and Skeptics and Scoundrels, Eric. Thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate it. You guys are awesome. We have a few super chats. Thank you, Mike, for staying back for a couple minutes. So first of all, we have a new channel member. Thank you. That's my dad, actually. Thanks, Dad. That's really nice. Michael Beverly, 50 pesos. Reading Mike's book right now. Just started last night. Just wanted to say hello and hope skeptics will support Lacona's work.
That's kind, Michael. And I've had 2 interviews with Michael and have enjoyed them. And what I've enjoyed about Michael, and also potential theism, Jordan there, and with you as well, David. I mean, we've been able to have a collegial conversation, but then
Yeah, I really
afterward,
enjoyed it.
neither Michael nor Jordan, and I don't think you will either, talk despairingly
I'm not
about.
going to make a 5
Yeah.
reasons why Mike is dumb. Dun, dun. Like, I'm not going to make a video like that.
Yeah, and it's like that's just a turnoff to a lot of us Christians.
No, of course not.
So
I do want to ask you this, because is it true that you lost your job because of or something,
Matthew's
because you
raised
didn't
saints.
the raised saints of Matthew?
No,
But,
it's not true.
it's not true.
It's not. That lie was started by Norman Geisler and one of his associates. What happened?
Okay.
What happened was I was working for the North American Mission Board, having fruitful ministry there. I mean, it's a mission board. It's not an academic institution. And I was going around the country and lecturing on college campuses and at pastors' conferences and things like this. And then Norman Geisler started to criticize me. And then I went to HR and another friend of mine who's a VP there. And I said, I think I need to resign because I don't want to bring a black eye to the North America. It's just a mission board. And they said, no, you'll be okay. And then Norman Geisler kept publishing and open letters to me against me. And so I talked to my wife and I said, I really think we need to resign. She says, well, what are we going to do? And I said, God will provide. We just got to do the right thing here. And so I went in and I resigned, and they turned down my resignation at first. And then by the end of the day, they accepted it. And they gave me a very nice, they were cutting back people anyway. And they told me it was already, when I went to the North American Mission Board, there was over 400 employees. When I left, there was 130 some. They were cutting back severely. And then they shared with me that it was 50-50 whether they were going to keep me out at the end of that year anyway. So it just made the decision easy for them. But they supported me a little bit, gave me some seed money, and I left on very good terms. When it came to Southern Evangelical Seminary, I had a conversation. Some of the faculty, those really aligned with Norman Geisler, were really questioning. And so the interim president asked me to have a it was not a Zoom call, but it was another one I just haven't heard of recently, WebEx or something like that.
Yeah. One of the.
And so I joined that call, and they just a number of the faculty blasted me with questions, and then finally Thomas Howell, who is an associate of Norman Geisler, said, well, I asked him a question because he seemed to be the most radical of them. And I said, hey, listen, do you think that the great red seven-headed dragon in Revelation, whose tail is going to sweep a third of the stars of heaven down to the earth, do you view that as a real space monster out there flying in the cosmos? And he said, yes. And at that point, I mean, it's clear that it's a metaphor for Satan. And it was clear at that point, I did not want to be associated with that seminary. And I called Gary Habermas and I said, I want to resign. And he said, oh, why? And I told him, he says, yeah, you probably should. And so I did. And then they spread the word that I got fired, which I didn't. And so I called the interim president and I said, I said, hey, why is this going around? And he said, I'll get to the bottom of this. And one guy almost got fired for spreading that lie. And I got a letter from the interim president saying I was in good standing and a friend of the seminaries. Even though
the only reason I bring that up is because I don't know if you know this, but proponents of the Jesus myth theory will use that as an example for why the Jesus myth theory hasn't gained ground. They say even Christians, if they don't hold to the strict narrative in academia, they're just ostracized, they're fired, and they will say this, and they'll use your example of being fired for not subscribing to the raised saints, and they'll use that and they'll say that's why the Jesus myth theory hasn't got wind in its sails, and has because it can't be.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, it is certainly the case in some like Southern Baptist seminaries are very conservative seminaries that, if you veer from some of their, very conservative doctrines, that your history. And so for that, some professors who may be entertaining other beliefs won't make those public. But that's also the same in secular universities too, where you'll have some Christian professors who won't openly profess their faith because they're afraid they won't get tenure or something. What I can say, though, is why it's so ridiculous is because even people like Bart Ehrman and other atheists and agnostics, Morris Casey, who was an agnostic who died a few years ago, they think that the Jesus myth hypothesis is absurd, whom no rational person should adopt. So why would Bart Ehrman, Morris Casey, and so many others think that? I mean, a lot of New Testament scholars, you go to the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion, and if you think that most New Testament scholars are Christians, in a sense that Jesus and his disciples would have recognized, you'll be awakened to your mistake very quickly. So why can only Richard Carrier only find approximately 13 scholars in the relevant fields in the entire universe who are living who would say that Jesus probably didn't exist? Why only 13 in the whole world?
Well, they're his disciples. His 13 disciples.
Huh?
No, I was just making a joke.
There's a reason why this is rejected by the overwhelming majority of scholars today, even some of your very, very skeptical ones and atheists out there.
Yeah. I've had some drama with the mythicists on this channel before, but I'll leave it at that. Michael Beverly, thank you for another 50 pesos. Have you had any more time to study Jewish customs? I still think going to spice an already dead and buried body by women is totally unbelievable.
Yeah, Michael, I haven't really studied that enough, so I can't. I would refer you to a book written by Rachel Hachlili, published by Brill. So it's an academic volume. The title of it is Jewish Burial Customs, Rites, and Practices in the Second Temple Period. And she'll talk about all those kinds of things in it. I don't even know if she's a believer, but she might know some more about stuff in that volume there. I mean, we could come up with some ad hoc kind of arguments, answer that may or may not be correct, but I just don't want to take a stab in it because it's not something I've studied.
Another $100 pesos. Thank you, Mark Beverly. Jewish laws are broken, hitting him, high priest tearing the coat, conflicting witnesses, done in secret, night, on holiday. Is this all literally convention, and why no Jewish polemic against?
Not sure what he means by that question. Why no Jewish polemic against? But no, I don't think it's literary convention. Even Josephus talks about the corruption of the Jewish leadership around that time. So that's not at all something that I think we need. I mean, it's certainly plausible with what other writers said of the Jewish leadership of that day.
Another one from Michael Beverly. Have you watched Darren Brown? He talks to the dead, does miracles of all kinds, reads minds, etc. He can convince atheists of spiritual things.
No, I've never heard of him. Yeah,
he's a magician, and he an atheist. He's not he tries to expose spiritual things, and he does this one episode that you should look up online, where he takes an atheist who doesn't believe in God, brings them into a church, and does a bunch of tapping and a bunch of things, and says a bunch of things that gets her to have a really tremendous spiritual experience. Mm-hmm. She leaves the room, and then she just starts bawling her eyes out, praying, looking at this figure of Jesus, and he's done it all through the power of suggestion. And it's quite incredible if you believe it. If you can believe it's not like a false thing. Anyway, it's interesting to watch. And one last super chat. Thank you so much, Searching Deeper, for the 70. I don't know what that currency is, but thank you so much. Paul, I think this is to me. Paul was blind for 3 days after his conversion until Ananias, prayed for him. How do you hallucinate being blind? That's not something you can be confused about.
I don't think that's a question for me. It's a question for you.
I think Yeah, I think that I don't know, but I think that could this be explained through some medical experience? I had a friend who was punched in the face and he lost in a boxing match and lost his sight in one eye for a week or something. And if people have epileptic fits, a whole lot of stuff can happen. So I don't know, but could this be explained through a medical thing? Maybe, I don't know. The thing that gets me, and Mike, is actually I won't even go there. But I don't know is the answer for me. But I just want to be respectful.
Can I throw something in here, David?
Yeah, sure.
When we look at different things like this particular story of Paul getting his sight back when Ananias prayed for him, we might be able to come up with a natural explanation for that. It would be quite ad hoc, but you might be able to come up with one. You might be able to come up with one for Peter. You might be able to come up with one for Paul. If all we had were Paul, then, I probably wouldn't believe it. If all we had was the testimony of Peter, then I probably wouldn't go with it. If all we had was the Ananias story, well, I probably wouldn't go with it. But the responsibility of the historian is to come up with a hypothesis that accounts for all of these things. And the best explanation to do it with the least amount of speculation. So, meaning you want the least ad hoc hypothesis. So that's why I think the resurrection hypothesis works better than the others. It is the only hypothesis that can really explain all the facts adequately without having to do unbridled speculation involved, without having to force things to fit. It comfortably accounts for all of the facts and does so really well.
I would argue that we do see forcing of the facts because we change a lot of the doctrines of the Old Testament. Messiah then becomes spiritual rather than like physical. There's a lot of like, well, actually, the Old Testament means this. Like, there's a lot of that going on. But let's just, I think, anyway, leave it for another conversation. 2 last questions for you, and then we'll wrap up. What, if anything, would change your mind?
Well, if archaeologists somehow were digging around in Jerusalem and found an ossuary that said Jesus, son of Joseph, who was called Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph, who was called the Messiah. And then you open it up and there's the skeletal remains of a crucified individual. And then there's some papyri inside that says, "We fooled the world until today." And it's signed by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then they do a DNA testing on the bones, and then they match it with some blood samples from the Shroud of Turin, and they say, this is the same guy. Well, I'd probably would have to say the resurrection has been refuted. Now, in all seriousness, they're probably, if you came up with something like that, then I'd say, yeah. Or if a naturalistic explanation could come up and do a much better job of explaining the data in my mind than the resurrection hypothesis, then I would be convinced he didn't rise from the dead. I just haven't seen anything like that.
Do you think it would affect your spiritual life? Do you think you'd continue to pray, or what do you think?
I would, because I'm still convinced by the evidence that God exists. I still think that the evidence, the scientific, philosophical, and even moral evidence for objective moral values still point to the existence of a designer and supreme being of the universe. And I would still try to live a moral life and try to live a moral, humble life before God. I would still stick with that. I would just give up Christianity.
That's actually what Michael Jones said, similar, actually. And last question, this is a fun one. What is the most plausibly true religion that you don't believe in?
That's a good question.
It's fun because everyone can answer it, right?
I guess I would just have to say not so much a religion, but I would say more of like a God exists, but he hasn't actually revealed himself specifically in one person.
Deistic kind of thought.
Well, I still believe theism is true because it seems to me that God has intervened in our world at times through certain miracles. I would just think that maybe God doesn't care a more general theism, and that maybe he doesn't care what you believe. Something like I would probably go with that.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We have your book, obviously. People should go check it out. Jesus Contradicted. You also have a YouTube channel. Let me just share this tab instead. Have you got anything coming up that people might be interested in checking out?
On the YouTube channel, I mean, we're always producing some content on there. A lot of shorts, the reels, and things like that. Some of the things that we're doing now are just things like interviews like this, or with Michael Beverly, or some of the others. Swan Sona is a graduate student at Harvard. He interviewed me last week on the book, and so we're doing some things like that. And posting that stuff for promoting that right now, and explaining, what's in the book, and things like that. So yeah, that's what we're doing. But we've got some other things. There's the Risen Jesus podcast that's on Apple and Google and some other things, and we'll be adding a whole lot more content on that come from videos that we're putting in audio format. And I'll be starting to pretty soon. I'll be starting to work on my next book, and I've got another one that I'll be working on after that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Michael O'Connor, for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed this, and we'll see everyone next time. Bye.